It's the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast, where we talk about all things consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, open relationships, swinging, and how you can have secure and sexy relationships, no matter how you do them. Now here's your hosts, Tara and Andre.
Hey, Andre.
Hey, Tara. Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with Tara and Andre.
That's us.
Awesome. We continue season 2, which has been an exciting season so far. And we still have a lot of great topics to share with you and special guests as well. So today, our topic is building, rebuilding, and maintaining trust in relationships, part 2.
I was just going to say part 2 because we covered so much in part 1, and there's a lot to be covered here. It could almost be done into 3 parts.
Exactly. Well, we'll try to get through it, but if we need to, we'll split it into another one. Part 1, we talked all about trust and how to build trust and maintain trust. And this time we're focusing more on the rebuilding when trust has been fractured or lost, which is, of course, one of the most difficult rebuilding that happens. So if you missed part 1, we recommend you go back and listen to that at some point because it was really good. But before we jump in, for those of you listening to us for the first time, I'm Tara. I am a relationship and awesomeness coach and specialize in supporting people navigating consensual non-monogamy.
And I'm Andre Turcott. I am a sex-positive psychotherapist.
And just one further announcement before we get into today's topic. So because we love to get back to this community and we're very thankful for our listeners, and would love to really see people be successful in navigating their open relationships like we have been. We have something special for you in honor of Polyamory Day, which was November 23rd, and Black Friday. So you can spend your Black Friday dollars on something that supports you and your relationships. So we are offering our Poly Newbies digital course at a wildly awesome price of $27, which is 90% off the regular price. We'd love to get this out there and love people to feel great in their relationships. Let's see if I can share my screen while we're chatting. There we go. So this is the sign up page. There we go. So this special offer ends on Monday, December 2nd. So that means you have basically 7 days. We want you to feel great, and you'll do that when you finish the course and you know exactly which style of non-monogamy works for you. You feel confident navigating all your relationships. You can handle jealousy, set boundaries, and communicate like a pro because communication, right? And you're building secure, fulfilling, and sexy relationships with all the guesswork. And so the course comes with trainings and activities you can do, basically your toolbox to support you in creating that foundation for your relationship, but also navigating issues as they arise. And you have 6 months to use the course, so that's a lot of time, but we always recommend people jump in right away, and especially with the holidays coming up close, it's ideal to get started right away if you can. And so the link to this will be in the show notes. So yay! So there's that. If you're watching this after this has passed, it's still a great deal at the regular price.
Sorry, Tara. I just want to say, listening to that description, it really is a blueprint, I guess you could say, for navigating successfully the world of non-monogamy.
Yeah, exactly. We intended this to be just a little small course that was a lot smaller than our bigger course, which includes coaching with us, our polyamory mastery course, but it actually evolved into something much more. And people have had great success. There's a video on there from one of our participants who told us it saved her marriage, and that feels super awesome. And so we'd love that for other people. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. In part 1, we just spoke about trust and how to build trust in a relationship. And, just a little bit of a recap. So what's trust?
That's a great question, right? Yeah. What do we mean when we say that we trust somebody or we trust in something? And I guess the most basic definition would say that trust is the act of placing confidence in someone or something else, right? So we are placing our confidence in, we believe them to be a certain way. We are confident that they will adhere to or act by certain agreements that we might have.
And it's a big, important thing to have trust in a relationship. It's like one of the foundational things. And we were talking about this after the first episode. We have the diagram of boundaries in terms of a ring, but you can think of trust in the same way. Have that outer circle where there's strangers on the outside. And maybe you only need to have a superficial level of trust for them, like trust in the government, trust in our politicians. Well, maybe you don't have trust in them. But, you have that small level of trust that they'll do the right thing, right? And then you move to more inner rings. So as you're getting closer to you as the person in the center, you have people that are acquaintances, people that are friends, and then moving even closer to siblings and family members where you have increasing need for trust because these are people that you're starting to be more emotionally vulnerable with. And so you want to have trust in those. And then all the way down to the center, which is partners, which you really need to have a really high level of trust in order to feel good in those relationships.
Well said. So it's kind of like the layers of an onion or concentric circles where we see from the outside level of emotional investment to a stranger or a classmate or something like that. There's some level of trust, but we're not really overly invested emotionally in them. And as such, we don't necessarily offer or expect a great level of trust moving all the way into, as you say, family members. And then even beyond that, maybe the most important trust we offer is that of a partner or partners.
And, and I don't know about you, but I've had situations I've been in where I don't feel that trust. It really shakes the stability of the relationship. And, it's once you've lost that trust and, then that can be a really difficult thing to overcome. And
yeah, it sure can. And it's interesting, though, to think also, how do we start out in most of our relationships? Do we come from a position where people need to gain or build our trust, or do we automatically assume? And I think not to get too far into that, but we might even see that in our attachment styles, right? If we came from a place that is more secure, we might be more apt to offer people trust and then see where that goes. Whereas if we feel more insecure, we might need those levels of trust to be demonstrated before we really allow for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked exactly about that in part 1. And that was a great discussion. So then people say, well, how can trust be broken in polyamory or non-monogamy? Because, some people say, it depends who you are, of course. In monogamy, like everything's on the table and everything's okay. But that's actually not necessarily true. And I think people who have that belief, who enter non-monogamy with that idea, are probably not going to be super successful in it, or at least not hold on to partners very long because, that just doesn't work. And so some of the things we talked about in part 1, in terms of how trust can be broken in non-monogamy, is when we're lied to. It doesn't have to be specific to the relationship, but lied in general. And that can also include withholding information about who we're seeing, what we're doing, etc. You look like you're going to say something.
No, it makes me think of what we've often heard people offer us is that you can't cheat in polyamory. You can't cheat. But that is absolutely not the case. Well, I think we're going to look at that in a bit as well, right? But the withholding of information, some people in non-monogamy might have an agreement that they have a don't ask, don't tell. And that is something that they mutually agree upon. But in that withholding of information, does it feel as though we're not wanting to share this because it would in any way perhaps compromise our own situation, or we wouldn't get what we're wanting? So what is the motive in it? Or is it actually part of our agreement where we say, well, I know the concept that you might be seeing other people. I don't necessarily want to know the details of it. And it's different.
Absolutely. So some of the other ways that you can lose trust is broken promises. People have this where someone agrees to do something and then they back out, or they consistently do this, like cancel dates and that sort of thing. Sometimes there's manipulation or misrepresentation. For example, like how a partner may actually feel about things in the relationship. I heard this recently. Someone was sharing that their meta was the problem because they were basically allowing or disallowing things in the relationship, to which I pointed out, well, maybe it's not a meta thing. It's actually your partner who's agreeing to those things. You know what I mean? It's always easy to blame somebody else, but if someone's agreeing to do those things, then they may be part of the issue as well.
Yeah. And then that's another thing. Do we enter into agreements that we don't really subscribe to?
Absolutely.
Does that make it harder for us to maintain? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, people do that all the time, right? And part of the reason people agree to certain rules is because they want to have the non-monogamous relationship. So maybe they say, okay, yeah, I'll agree to this rule that I have to get your permission for everything. But it does put other people in a difficult spot.
And it's interesting to ask ourselves, well, why would we agree to something that we don't really agree to? And I wonder to what extent it might be fear-based. Well, I'm afraid that if I don't make these agreements, I'm not going to get what I'm after. I'm not going to have the relationship that I think I want.
Absolutely.
So I'm be more willing to kind of, bend those things or try in all earnest to acclimate to them. But if they're not really aligned with my own values or my own desires, it's going to cause difficulty.
So then those are a lot of things we talked about in part 1. So have a listen to that. But if a breach of trust has happened and somebody, broke the trust that you had in them, it may leave you feeling hurt or shocked. Sometimes people feel actually physically ill. And it might prompt you to consider your relationship and your partner in a different way. Like, is this someone I should stay with? Is it someone that's deserving of my trust, etc.? And I think that's an important thing to check first. You know what I mean? Is there a reason to work through things and a willingness to do so? And if so, then we've got some suggestions for you. But I think it's also important to recognize when someone is not worthy of our trust. And maybe something is going on that's not good for us, that's even toxic. And I think, like you said before, when the house is on fire, find safety. So this may be a safety situation. So it's something you really have to consider.
Tara, that's such a great point that you bring up, right? Is the person in themselves trustworthy or not or worthy of our trust? And it's interesting because going back to the earlier part, let's say we do have a good or rather viable relationship, and then there is this breach of trust. It might make us question the entire relationship when it might have simply been one situation, one occasion. But that's the problem with lying and the breach of trust is it makes us question everything else. Then we say to ourselves, well, if you lied about this, what else might have you lied about? So I might have lied so I get to have, a sexual encounter with somebody else. And maybe it is specific to that one time. And I'm not necessarily distrustworthy, but yet somehow it then comes back and it is found out to be a lie. And now it makes us question everything. So it's no longer simply about that one act, that one situation, that sleeping with that person. It is now a question of trust. And it really does affect us in the point where we then ask, well, if this was the possible scenario, if this happened in this one case, where might it also have happened? And it really makes us second guess and question all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, trust can also, like we talked about withholding information, but clients have told us this as well, can be also withholding feelings or changing feelings. And that's a tricky one too, because sometimes we don't want to share all of our feelings because maybe our partner will have a response to that. But then if we don't share those, is that an equal issue?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So I might be holding back my feelings, for example, and then you're not privy to it. So you're not really getting the information necessary to make that consensual agreement. So if I have changed or I have shifted and things have changed on my part and I don't share that with you, how are you going to be able to communicate or be there as honestly? Because I'm not being so forthcoming or honest with my thoughts and feelings too. And often we might kind of justify that position saying, well, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to make you feel a certain way. But I am, in a sense, in a very real sense, then taking the ability to consent away from you by making the judgment for you and saying, well, I thought that I would make this on your behalf. And that's not what it's about.
But there's also the possibility too that when you have shared your feelings in the past, that there has been such a strong response by your partner. So it doesn't feel like it's safe to share those feelings. And so that's something that has to be considered. And I mean, we're all about sharing honestly and fully. And my advice has been to clients and people I've talked to in the group is to create a safe space for open and honest dialogue. You have to have the ability to share all the things because it's really the only way that you can truly get through an issue where someone feels trust, and it might be trust on both sides, the person not sharing or the person who's not trusting.
And even though at times it might be difficult for us to hear these things or we're not wanting to hear them, we can trust that the other person is going to be honest about where they're at, what they're feeling, what they're thinking. So maybe the message is not optimal, but we trust that the person will be forthcoming, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah, one of the things we have people do in our Poly newbies course, it's in the communication module, is we do this little exercise where they do this thing called Will I Be Safe? I'm not going to go into it, but it's something that I think is important because you have to have a safe space for sharing those feelings. That's a big aside, but trust is such a big topic and it impacts people in many different ways. So if you do want to work through the trust, and maybe you're not sure if this person is trustworthy or worthy of your trust, you can start doing these things, and some of this will also help you out. We're going to cover 6 things in this episode that are great starting points. I'll list them quickly here, and then we'll go into them in detail. So the first is considering the reason behind the betrayal. Number 2 is communicate, which, goes through all of them, as you might imagine. Number 3 is releasing the anger that you might have. Number 4 is rebuilding the trust, and we've got specific steps on that. And number 5, showing commitment and rebuilding the relationship from scratch almost. And then number 6 is get support. So let's go into the first one. Consider the reason behind the lie or betrayal, whatever it's been.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, right? So we want to be self-reflective. We want to consider what might have led to our feeling the need or desire to lie, right? What might be the reason?
Yeah, and sometimes if you've been lied to, you may not really care about what the reason is. But sometimes people do lie when they simply don't know what else to do. We kind of just talked a bit about that. It doesn't make their choice right, but it may help to consider how you might have reacted in their position.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. Often we don't care, right? You're an adult. I don't care why you lied. I just don't want you lying to me. And we feel hurt and angered by that, and justifiably so. But once that kind of settles and our feeling of betrayal, mistrust, the hurt has been acknowledged, to ask why it came to this, how did it come to be, could be very informative, and most importantly, may then inform us so that we prevent the need or desire or difficulty in lying going forward, that we might then find other ways besides lying about it. So it is.
Yeah. And sometimes, when somebody lies to you or betrays you, they're often doing it to protect themselves, but they may have had other motives, like were they trying to protect you from bad news or a particular feeling, or making the best of a money situation, or to help a family member. Those are more general outside relationship stuff, or lying or cheating and that sort of thing.
They could be, and those would be maybe the best case scenario, the wonderful reason. Well, unfortunately, often it is fear-based, that the person fears that they're not going to get what they're wanting, what they want. And it is unfortunately selfish, that they consider themselves first. And we're going to look at that as well.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the person doesn't always they realize but don't realize that they're doing this thing. Like, I know I cheated on my husband. Somehow I justified it in my brain, either consciously or subconsciously, and felt that it was okay for some reason. But then as soon as I told him, I felt the full brunt of that sharing. Like it all of a sudden became clear that what I did was wrong. And so sometimes people get into that situation. So in terms of considering the reason behind the betrayal, it could also be miscommunication or misunderstanding. That's another possibility. But whatever the reason, it's important to make it clear that what they did wasn't okay. But knowing the reasons behind their actions may help you decide whether you're able to begin rebuilding the trust. For the offender, the person who did the thing that caused the mistrust needs to consider why they did it. Really honestly considering this. Because, again, looking back at my own personal situation, why did I do this? So for somebody who may have cheated or withheld information in a relationship, or started seeing someone and their feelings are stronger, maybe it's possible that you wanted to end the relationship but didn't want to.
That resonates with me. Maybe I was doing it in a kind of self-destructive or relationship destructive way, right? What would it have been like, though, had I resisted going into that action and spoken about it first?
Yeah. Do you feel like in your past situations that you've talked about it?
No, I think the majority of times, well, on exception maybe, but the majority of times, I think that there was something going on in the relationship that wasn't quite right. and maybe I wasn't getting the love I felt I needed, or wasn't getting the affection I wanted, or whatever it was. But I felt in whatever way, perhaps somewhat justified in going to it. But more to the point, I think I felt that I was afraid that if I were to say how I felt, it would not be met well. So then I took it upon myself to decide for them, that I robbed them of their consent, and I did what I wanted to do because I was afraid that it would not work out my way. So it was essentially fear-based. And then I came later on to recognize that that was not the way to do it. What would have been better would be to announce my feelings and say, well, I'm feeling this way about them, or these are my desires, or whatever it might be. But then I could let them know that I was a trustworthy person, that I could have my thoughts and feelings, even if they were not necessarily going to be well received in the desires. At least they could not reproach me for being distrustful, that I could know that I was doing the right thing in that. And it takes a bit of a leap of faith at times to be able to go beyond our fear, but we have to do that because we want to look at ourselves in a way that feels we have a higher level of esteem rather than considering ourselves to be liars and cheaters. It's just not a pleasant place to be.
And were you conscious about that you were doing this, maybe sabotaging things, or?
I think later on, before I fully became aware of subscribing to non-monogamy, I think I did become more and more aware how I was essentially being selfish, in that I was making my decisions out of fear rather than feeling that I had the security to announce my own position, to announce my own thoughts and feelings. Not to say that they were going to be granted. It's not to say that they were in any way right or wrong, but I could always have my own thoughts and feelings. And by being dishonest, it was robbing them and myself the ability to acknowledge those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. The second reason, the offender, why they did it, were there specific needs that weren't being met by your partner? And that's, I think, where it falls from my situation when I was married. My partner was away. I recognized that I was lonely. I was worried that I was becoming more attractive to someone at work. And, I subtly tried to communicate it, but not directly. I do remember telling him, I really think you need to stay home for the summer, but I didn't say why. I wasn't completely honest. And so I was lonely. We were really new to being married, and I was in a new job and in a new house in a small community, and I just needed him to be there, and I wanted him to be there, and he wasn't. And so I did say some of that, but didn't say directly that there was a possibility that I might cheat or that I'd become attracted to someone else. I'm kind of curious, actually, what he would have said if I had shared that.
Oh, that's an interesting consideration. But in so much of that, and I can relate to so much of that as well, how my needs were, one, not being well communicated. I didn't really announce what it was that I was needing and missing. And then how I might have felt justified in taking it upon myself. Well, I left you some little hints. I left you some little communications, and they weren't really acknowledged. So then I felt kind of justified. Well, if they're not that interested, then I'll go out and find somebody who is. It's not my right to make that decision for the other person. And it makes me think very much about our axiom, where we always say it's about communication, communication, communication. So to what extent did I communicate openly and honestly about it? And to that point, was I afraid that if I felt, if I were to say that these are my needs, what if they were acknowledged but then not met? Or what if it was going to foil my attempts to get the satisfaction someplace else?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the other reasons why someone might not have been honest about it. You also touched on, are you in an agreement with something that you don't fully agree with? You talked about people agreeing to certain rules and agreements, and maybe that's not something you actually want. And so your comment about communicating segues very perfectly into number 2, the second thing you can do in order to rebuild trust. And of course, it's communicate, communicate, communicate.
Mm. And Terrence, at that point, it makes me think of the idea, well, I already communicated my ideas with them. I already told them how I felt, as though it's like a one-time, one and done kind of deal. And it's not, because we were just talking about how the agreement may or may not align with my values. But what happens if they don't fully align, or if they've changed over time, or if they need to be modified or revisited? So can we communicate that as well? What's our level of comfort in communicating? And for many of us, we might estimate ourselves to be excellent communicators until we actually come to find out, well, maybe we're not as great at communicating as we thought, or maybe not as comfortable. But like most things, it does increase over time with practice. So we might learn different strategies of communicating that make us feel as though it is more viable, more acceptable to communicate our thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, and your point about agreements and, what have I agreed to is an important one. And because I think sometimes people think we decided how we're going to have an open relationship and that's it. But in order to be successful, you really do have to revisit any agreements that you have and talk about the relationship. It's why in the course we talk about developing a values-based agreement and doing regular relationship reviews and check-ins. And so communicate.
But it's interesting, though, how we might find ourselves agreeing to something that we don't necessarily really fully subscribe to or agree with. And again, that might be essentially fear-based, right? I'm afraid to tell you that I don't really feel as strongly about this because I'm afraid that if I were to say that, you might say, well, then we're not well aligned enough. So I become selfish again in my fears, and I agree to something that maybe not as beneficial, as appropriate as I might want it to be, as opposed to saying, well, I appreciate how you're saying this and what you think about it and how you feel, but I feel this way about it. Again, it comes back to the invitation of consent, right? We can consent to this or not. So am I essentially consenting to something that doesn't feel quite right? And again, how would it be if I were to announce that and say, well, I might be wanting something a little bit different?
Yeah, right. So the thing about communication is it can be painful or uncomfortable, but one of the biggest aspects of rebuilding trust after betrayal is talking about the situation. And so, as we do with anything that comes up in a relationship, it's important to set aside time and talk about the situation. And so and how you feel about the situation. So if something's happened and you're feeling now distrust in the other person, you want to use the nonviolent communication method and our 2-minute communication process to communicate how you feel about the situation. So this is all about, using I and me. When this happens or happened, I felt this is what I need, and this is what I'd like you to help with. And part of that communication is to talk about why the betrayal or trust hurt you. And so if something's happened to you, you really need to dig into what it was what actually are you feeling about this? Like, why does it feel like distrust to you?
Yeah. Why does it feel distrustful? But to that, Tara, I want to add that once the breach of trust has been discovered or announced, and we want to invite each other to have these conversations, we should bear in mind that the first time talking about it may be rather difficult because there is such levels of responsibility, guilt, we'll say, and of anger and distrust. So maybe it's not so easy to have that. But again, the only chance we have is by talking about it openly and recognizing the big feelings that will be coming up here. And if necessary, we will take breaks. But as you say, we will communicate in ways that adhere to nonviolent communication or communication attunement. And this will help conversation.
And active listening, especially for the person who's made betrayal, like really listen to what your partner is saying. And I think you made a really great point. You beat me to it. It's about taking breaks. And I think the thing that we talk about in terms of communication is one thing at a time, and really giving the person who's speaking or sharing the opportunity to share what they feel, and for you as the listener to respond and speak back what it is they said, what you heard, and make sure you understand it. And so if you feel if the person was betrayed, it's important to give your partner time to talk, and I know that's hard when you've been betrayed, but let them share their feelings well. And, I think it's important too, because it'll give you a sense of their sincerity, and there may be things, they may be truly regretful for what's happened. And, and that may be part of it. Do they apologize, or are they defensive, or are they unwilling to own up to their own, the thing that they did? Those may be important things for you to understand in order to regain trust in that person.
And, It's difficult actually on both sides, right? Because one, we have to be able to absorb what just happened as the person that it's been done onto, I guess we could say, and have to deal with all our feelings and our justifiable anger and our sense of betrayal. But also for the culprit, it's also difficult for them too, because they do have to be present and receive all of that anger and acknowledge their part in it. So it's not easy on either side, right? But it's going to have a chance to be deconstructed by talking about these openly, by being emotionally present in these discussions.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize or be prepared for that you might feel emotional or upset during these conversations, but these feelings are completely valid. If you do feel you're getting too upset to continue communicating in a protective way, like you said, take a break and come back to it. Also, we suggest you're having any difficult conversations in a neutral place.
Yeah.
In a park, maybe in a place where you don't necessarily have to look at each other if you have to express strong feelings, but in a neutral way, on a walk, that sort of thing. Easier to feelings when you're not feeling like you have to stare the person straight in the face.
Right. And even if we're not necessarily conscious of it, we tend to be on better behavior when we are out in public, when we are indoors, especially when it's first starting or when we're revisiting these painful issues. We might be tempted to kind of raise our voices and maybe even say words that describe our level of hurt and anger, but maybe aren't really adding towards progressive communication. So we want to be mindful of how we're talking about that. We want to be able to have our feelings and thoughts recognized, but we also have to be mindful of how we are conveying them as we would want them to be conveyed as well.
Exactly. But having said that, I think one of the important things as well, and this is our number 3, is to find a way to release the anger. And I don't mean by having a yelling match. It's because a breach of trust can really lead to mental, emotional, and physical problems. Like people have trouble sleeping, diminished appetite, or maybe they're binge eating. You may become irritable. It may impact other relationships you have. So you really need to take the time and space and find ways of releasing the anger. We don't want it, and that's not about stuffing those emotions down, tuning into those feelings and reflecting on the impact they have. Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, we definitely want to create space, a safe space for the recognition of our anger and finding ways to articulate rather than demonstrate our anger, right? So we want to resist kind of going to the drink or the drug or the eating or whatever it is. We want to find avenues of discharge that feel secure and will help us process our thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. And some of that needs to be done on our own, but some of it obviously needs to be done and shared with our partner. One of the exercises that some people find helpful in these situations is to do a write and burn. You don't necessarily have to burn it, but in a journal or on a piece of paper or typing it out or doing a voice memo, like get all those feelings out. This is why I'm feeling and all that stuff. And then some people suggest actually burning it. I mean, you can do that. That's kind of fun, but it's not necessary, but it's good to get all those things out if you feel like they're stuck inside your body. Some people do art. So, yeah.
In the burning of it, that process, I think it's symbolic of the idea that you touched on earlier. And that is, we don't deny that happened and we're not minimizing it, but we do try to offer ourselves the ability to let it go. So once it has been acknowledged, once it has been seen in that way, if we continue to go back to it and go back to it and go back to it, are we really increasing the quality of the relationship? Or are we simply still hanging on to that part where it burnt us so much? But if we can recognize in our partner that they recognize the errors of the way, or if I'm going to say that we're the victim in this case, and they recognize it, and we get the sense that they are really acknowledging and remorseful towards it, then can we let go of the hurt, not so much as a way of pinning it on them, but freeing ourselves from it, ideally, right? So we want to be able to let things go and find a way to heal from that, as opposed to feeling as though it's not been satisfied and hanging on to it. So letting it go is a big part of that.
Yeah. And you have to figure out, if you are hanging on to it, why you're hanging on to it. What need is that serving? We've talked about this before, and it's also in the course. We have an exercise on our jars of resentment. And this came up when I was working with somebody who was an artist and was great at visualizing things. And she says, yeah, I have these jars and they're full of resentments. And when something comes up in the relationship, unrelated to those things, those jars get opened up again and released and are like bombs, right? And, that was why she was holding on to them, was to use them to punish their partner for anything, right? And so those resentments need to be aired out and the anger needs to be released in order to fully rebuild trust. And so if you're holding on to those things, the question is, what's making you hold on to those things?
Yeah. And to that point too, I would add, it's one thing to have these conversations about it and then have my partner say, well, they recognize the errors of their way. That's wonderful. Those words are important. But what about the action that goes forward? So for me, the easiest way to let go of anger, it goes beyond the discussion that we're having, but in the demonstration of the other person that they really do see why their lying or their mistrust was not a good way and that they conduct themselves differently. And the same would be for me. If I am truly aware of what happened, if I'm truly remorseful, what will I do to influence or change the behavior going forward? Because I think actions in the case speak loudest. So when I come back to another difficult situation, do I again take it upon myself to make the decision, or do I go to my partner or partners and let them know of my thoughts and feelings so that they can make an informed decision as well?
Absolutely. I think in releasing the anger, even the person who's done the offending may have some anger themselves, and it's important to recognize that and release that for yourself. They may feel terrible. They may feel like they're a horrible person, feel guilty. There's all kinds of things that would need to also be released. So it's important for them to do that as well. I know when this situation happened in my marriage, after I told him, I literally had a breakdown. I just couldn't emotionally handle it. I couldn't go to work. It's funny how the telling impacted me so profoundly, but it did. And so then on top of that, I also had to deal with his hurt as well. So it was an overwhelming situation. Mm-hmm. And so that can happen for the person who did the thing that lost the trust by the other person. So that's important to remember too. So,
but that's a great point, right? So the offender may feel some level, or they may be angry at themselves. Well, why did I agree to go into a situation that was not going to be fully satisfying, or to speak to my needs, or whatever it was? So they may be angry at themselves for not being able to communicate, or believing that they're not able to communicate their feelings or their thoughts. But we use it as a learning point and say, well, I'm going to resist simply feeling angry about it, and I'm going to affect the change. And I will affect that change by communicating my true feelings and desires.
Absolutely. All right. So that's great. Moving on to rebuilding trust. So that's number 4. I think it's important to set specific goals and realistic timelines for getting yourself back on track. This is not a thing that necessarily happens quickly. And also, like you said, it's not just one conversation, it's multiple conversations. So recognize it takes time, and here's some things that you can do. So decide to forgive or be forgiven, and making a conscious decision to let go of the past. And this is something for both people. And I think it's important to commit to this idea. So, if you don't have this part, I think it might be more difficult to get over it. Like if something's happened, like, okay, I'm going to work towards forgiving you for something. And for the person who did the offending, I'm also going to work towards being forgiven too. So the second part is being open to self-growth and improvement. So you can't, like you said, pair broken trust with promises and statements of forgiveness. The underlying causes for the betrayal need to be identified, examined, and worked on by both people for the issues to not come up again, or to be able to be resolved in a different way the next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I want to say, as you rightly pointed out, it may take some time. So as the offender, I acknowledge it, and then I say, well, I'll do better going forward. And voila, the next time it comes up, I am forthcoming, and I let you know how I feel. I resist the temptation, we'll say, of lying. And then I think, well, automatically, okay, everything should be good now, right? We're done. You see this in me this one time. It doesn't work that way, right? The impression of that betrayal may be very deep and profound and may take some time. So we have to be understanding of that and really empathetic to where that other person is coming from.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think it's important to do is being aware of your feelings and sharing your thoughts on an ongoing basis, like you just said, and we said several times. So leaving one side to obsess about the situation or action that broke the trust is not going to solve anything. You know what I mean? Like, you're just going to have to get over it, or, I'm just going to have to do something better. Like, it's a process of working together and working through those feelings of hurt or anger or that sort of thing. And another part is wanting it to work. So you need to make a conscious decision that you want it to work. You want to rebuild the trust. You want to have that forgiveness, give the forgiveness. That's a point that you need to pay attention to and be aware of. And this goes back to that when we were talking about, is this person really worthy of my trust? Is it something that they want to work out or not do again, or whatever it is, is there that willingness to want it work?
Right. And the person, again, they may have been a one-time kind of thing that happened. And maybe we, in some ways, is almost overestimate that because of our past, where we're coming from. If we already have issues of trust and betrayal, then do we kind of overestimate that and say, well, no, you're one and done, that's it? Or are we able to tolerate that and really see that there's some kind of exploration as to what was at play, and then see how it's not indicative of their behavior throughout? All the rest of it really does seem as though they are a trustworthy person, but this thing happened. So we make that assessment. We say, well, yes, I could live through this. Or we say, well, you know what? No, I'm not wanting this to work. It is too familiar to me, or they do not warrant the level of trust necessary to be in a relationship with them.
Yeah, and for some people, this could really strengthen the relationship. It could be the thing that really opens the dialogue between them, or, it might not. And so you made a good point earlier, Andre, about talking about what you do as the person the offender, so to speak, who compromised the situation. And it might be hard for them to be reminded of what they did wrong, but if you want to recover for it and be forgiven, it's important to do some of your own work. So you said actions, right? So show that this behavior is gone by changing your behavior, and show that. If you're the one in your relationship that lied or cheated or broke the trust, that means no more secrets, no more lies, or anything of that sort. So you're going to need to be completely transparent, open, and forthcoming. And that's part of what you can do in terms of showing.
And for the person who may have done the lying or the cheating, we do ask that you be more forthcoming, that you are transparent in this. But when you find it difficult to do so, then you might ask yourself that very question. Well, what's making it difficult to be more open, more forthcoming, more transparent?
Mm-hmm.
What am I afraid of? What do I imagine might happen if I were to announce it, if I were to say these things? Am I afraid that I might not get my own way, that I might not be so well received or rejected if I were to put this forward? So again, is it essentially fear-based that is doing this? Is it out of my own greed, my own interest, as opposed to being considerate of the other as well?
Yeah, and maybe it's not greed. Maybe the situation is not one you want to be in, and that's important to recognize as well, right?
By greed, I mean self-interest.
Oh, self-interest. Okay, I got you. But maybe your self-interest is not to be in this kind of relationship. And it's important to recognize this as well. And if that is the case, then please don't drag the other person through it.
Or yourself, absolutely. But we live such complicated lives. So then we tell ourselves, well, maybe it's not ideal for me, but extracting myself, trying to blow this up seems far too dangerous, too complicated, much more difficult. Would it be easier for me to just remain and just tell a couple of white lies or cheat when necessary?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think ultimately it's going to get to you, right? Like it's really, yeah. Like, are you just wasting time for yourself and for the other person?
Yeah, precisely, right? So it might be you get that minor little victory in the short run, but it's not sustainable. And also how we feel about ourselves, right? Unless we're sociopaths, we probably have some level of empathy, and it just wasn't feeling right to do that.
Exactly. And so for the offender, the other things you can do is we want you to be honest and to understand why it actually happened. So if you say, I don't know, when the person says, why did you do this thing? It doesn't instill confidence, and it also doesn't help you heal, so it's important to be specific. And if you don't know, really dig into why, that might have happened and what was really behind it for you.
Yeah, that's such a great point, right? Because I don't know answer doesn't lead to progressive communication. It doesn't offer insight as to where our thought patterns were, what we were feeling at that time.
And then take responsibility for your actions and your decisions. So apologize with sincerity and avoid defensiveness. There may be reasons behind what you did, but there aren't reasons for lying or not communicating things. And so, be very specific around what it is you did and, avoid putting the blame on your partner. For example, I'm sorry I lied to you about where I was going. I know I should have told you the truth. I regret causing you pain. I want you to know I won't do it again. But try to also avoid making promises you can't keep in order to people please. So that there's that in there too.
So in the idea that I'll never do it again, that's a promise that we can't really know, I suppose. But in our actions, our demonstration over time, that would indicate whether or not we've ever done it again.
Yep. So if you are the person that did the thing, make sure you follow up by telling the person exactly how you intend to avoid making the same mistake again. But this has to be authentic. If you really don't think you cannot say that to somebody. You just can't. You want to
exactly. We don't say it as lip service for the other person because we know it would make them feel better, just the sound of it. We have to only offer it when it actually aligns with our own values.
And I think for the person that, felt the betrayal, while there's a lot for the person who did the betrayal to do, there's also things for you to do. And even if somebody was lied to us or whatever, there's often a reason behind it. So we could look to see if we had any part in it. Is there anything that could have been done differently that might have avoided that? And that's not to say you shift the blame on you when someone does something, but it is important to understand why things went the way they did. And understanding why this might have happened for this person can be important to understand and be able to get through this.
I think that's well said.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to provide positive reinforcement when your partner is sharing things and why they do that, because that'll continue to create a safe space for them to share. And so I know it's hard when you're the one that's been betrayed, but it's also important too. And if you really want to get through that, it's important to be able to create that safe space.
Tara, that's such a wonderful point, right? That if we are able to provide that positive response, and it does demand a high level of compassion on our part. But in all fairness, I wonder if we really do look at the person as overall good, but they lied because of whatever reasons, how we might appreciate how it might have in some ways been difficult for them not to excuse their behavior. And they will, going forward, have to step up and resist that temptation to lie. But if we can be in any way considerate, compassionate towards them, would it make it easier for us to then let go of our hurt? So I recognize that it maybe wasn't familiar to you to communicate openly like this. I recognize that it wasn't something you were wanting to do either. So I am considerate and compassionate in that point, and I try to give you a second chance, but I also do it with my eyes open, and I see the proof in the action.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, as always, Andre, to number 5, which is showing commitment to rebuild the relationship. And so it's perfectly understandable when things happen to question their commitment to the relationship and wonder if it's still right for them or even salvageable. And so things like acts of empathy, sharing pain, frustration, anger, showing remorse and regret, and allowing the safe space for all of this can be healing to both people, regardless, actually, if you decide to stay together. Going through a healing process after a loss of trust, even if the end result is that you don't stay together for whatever reason, it's still a great process for you to go through. And it will help you avoid you bringing these issues of trust to future relationships.
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
And so one of the things we recommend in terms of building the relationship is treating the relationship like it's a completely new one, letting go of the things and rebuilding almost from the start. Like, what is it we want our relationship to be? And both sides asking what they really need and not expecting their partner to simply know what they want. So this is that open communication. It's an interesting concept of reimagining the relationship. And it's a hard thing to do. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's an interesting way to look at it. Like, how do you want to build this house from the ground up, and what's in the house?
To that point, Tara, it's interesting how we, again, might kind of assume what the other person wants. But I wonder if we were to ask each other, well, what is it that you think I'm wanting in this relationship? And then we find out, well, how accurate is that statement? How much does it really align with my feelings and values and all those things?
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to not withhold trust in this new relationship. So if you've gotten to this point and done all these things, don't hold that thing and bring it into the new house. You have to decide to let it go and start from a place of trust again. And, not that this is going to take 2 seconds to do, it's going to take some time, but what are you building into this house and how do you make that work? I think part of this is coming to an agreement about what a healthy relationship looks like to you both. And so this may be revisiting your relationship agreement, going back into what style of non-monogamy or works for us, or does it even work for us? And so there's all kinds of things you can do: rebuilding connection, quality time, date nights, understanding your love languages, checking in more regularly about how things are.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? What can we do to rebuild together? And it's in that togetherness. What kind of little activities, daily activities, can we find ourselves as participants in together, so that we feel as though there's less of that void of separation in the breach of trust, and now there are bridges being made that will come together and make it feel as though we are, again, intertwined and on the right path.
Exactly. And I think the other point to make is, once you do this, avoid dwelling in the past. And it's not that you forget completely, but it shouldn't be trotted out every time there's something going on in the relationship. You're building a new relationship. And so that's something in the old relationship. And so it's important to let it go back into the past. And if you can't, then that's something you need to continue working through that.
And then also, as the other partner, we allow for this, right? So ideally, yes, we're able to let it go and it doesn't come back. But when and if it should, we also acknowledge those feelings and say, yes, I understand that there's still a lot of hurt here and it will take some time, but we are working towards that, if that is in fact the demonstration of our working towards that.
And so number 6 is get support. Getting past a breakdown in trust is not easy, even when you do all of these things. And, you don't have to do this alone. All relationships go through rough patches, and there's absolutely no shame in reaching out to get help. In fact, I think it's actually the opposite. Some people feel like going to a therapist or a coach or something like that means that they're weak or they can't deal with their own shit. But I think it actually shows great courage and strength to reach out for help. Like, I'm not a plumber. I wouldn't try to fix a leaky tap. Well, I might YouTube it. But when the YouTube one doesn't work, I'll probably reach out to someone who's an actual professional, those sorts of things. So,
yeah, I think that's actually a point well taken. It is perhaps easier to dismiss it and say, oh, it's okay, or want to minimize it or whatever. It is a sign of strength to say, no, there's something here that needs some work, and we're going to roll up our sleeves and go to it. We're going to actually look at it and find ways of addressing it.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes to do that on our own, because it's hard to face some of the truths. And working with a therapist or a coach can help you dig out those things. I've had clients that are counselors themselves, and one of the things that they appreciated was asking the tough questions, or maybe the things that we don't want to admit, and having it happen in a safe space for you and your partner. So we already mentioned that some things you can do is, of course, like get individual and couples coaching therapy. And so both of us offer consultations you can do. So I'll make sure I put those links in the show notes. But do your own research. There's tons of people out there. Find someone that works for you. You can do some additional research. Like I said, there's YouTube videos and podcasts and things. Do these things together. Listen to a podcast together. Talk about these things. Look for the resources online. They're out there. You might want to take a course or join a program. And of course, we have one. I mentioned at the top is that we have our Poly Newbies digital course, which is a 7-module course in a special offer for our community for $27 until Cyber Monday. So it's a great chance to catch that. What else?
Keep talking. Say everything.
Say everything. Say everything. Yeah, so if you have any questions, reach out, check out the show notes for additional information, and of course, catch part 1 if you didn't. Thanks, Andre.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
If you want to have relationships that are secure, sexy, and satisfying, take advantage of our Black Friday deal on our Poly Newbies digital course. Only $27 until December 2nd, 2024. Thanks for listening to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with TNA. Don't forget to subscribe and give us some love on your favorite podcasting platform. You can check out the show notes for any of the links to the courses or information we talked about today. Thanks, and have a fantastic and sexy day.